Hi everybody, this is Mr. Yeoman again, and what we're looking at today is the impact of water on ecosystems and the environment. Now we all know that water is important for living things, but what we usually don't think very much about is the importance of having clean drinking water. So here in the US, we kind of take that for granted. Most of us have water purification systems, either large plants or some people use wells. But even that water is typically cleaned in one way or another. So I wanted to start with just talking about how the different types of water treatment is made, and tying this together with some of the ideas on biodiversity and ecosystems. So typically most water treatment systems, so here in Des Moines what we have is a very typical type of water treatment system. We use chlorine to help clean our water. Now what a lot of people seem to forget is where does our water come from? There are a couple different sources. So in some parts of the country they use aquifers. So they are taking underground lakes essentially and pulling the water out. And, that's also where how wells work, is we're taking water from groundwater. Now that water is typically fairly clean depending on where you are and what's going on around you. The soil actually filters out some of the nastiness that might be in your water. But here in Des Moines what we do is we take it from the rivers around us. So that would typically be the Des Moines River or the Raccoon River, depending on exactly what part of the city you live in. Now that's going to have debris and other information. I'm going to point you towards a website talking about Arcata Marsh in California and how they do that. Now I'll go into a little bit more detail about how we separate out water and filter that out. But the first thing we have to do is get the solids out of the water. Okay, so sometimes we refer to this as turbidity. If you look at a lake, sometimes you can see through a lake very, very easily. Sometimes lakes look kind of muddy. And so what we're looking at is how turbid that water is, how many particles are in it. So obviously if you can see particles, you're probably not going to want to drink that water. So that's our first step, is that we have to filter out these things, and it's done in a variety of ways of actually using filters sometimes. Sometimes it's done by chemical means where stuff will connect chemically and then it'll drop to the bottom, so they just wait for things to settle out and then let the clearer water go through to the next phase. This can have a variety of different types of processes. So that's kind of the easy part, is saying, all right, so I want something that doesn't look gross. But the harder part is, what about the stuff you can't see? So bacteria, other chemicals that are in the water. Right now we're talking about this at a time when Flint, Michigan has some very, very serious water quality problems. There's lead in their water, which causes severe brain damage. Here in Iowa right now, we were talking about Des Moines, and the Des Moines Water Works is suing 3 counties in northern Iowa and mostly northwestern Iowa for the amount of nitrates that are in the water. Now most people don't know what nitrates do. For most of us, it isn't a big deal, but it can be a very serious problem, especially if the nitrate levels get too high. It's a very serious problem for infants. So if you have a child who is drinking formula, then those nitrates end up getting broken down into nitrite. Now, that is done by E. coli. Now, as an adult, I have a pretty good digestive system. My stomach is going to kill a lot of bacteria, so E. coli isn't getting up into my stomach. It's not getting into my upper digestive system. So there's not a huge issue of nitrates being turned into nitrite. But for infants, that is a problem. They don't have as good of a digestive system, so there's sometimes E. coli growing in the stomach, and so if they're drinking water that has nitrates in it, that can be turned into nitrite. Now that's a problem because nitrite will bind to the hemoglobin in the baby's blood. Well, if you remember from biology, hemoglobin carries oxygen, so if nitrite is binding to that hemoglobin instead of oxygen, essentially what you're doing is suffocating that baby, and you get something called blue baby syndrome. I know, very, very, obvious name, but what we're doing is you're depriving that baby of oxygen, and in severe cases, you can have children who can lose limbs. or have brain damage because they're not getting enough oxygen. So that's a very serious problem, and that takes work to remove some of those items. Probably the bigger problem for most communities is bacteria. So you can clean this water, but you have to get it out pretty far from that water treatment plant. And so we're going to push that water out, and what can happen sometimes along the way is that it becomes contaminated by bacteria. So we put things into the water in order to make sure that we don't maintain that bacteria, or that bacteria won't survive. And so what's most common is chlorine, is putting chlorine in your water. There are a couple different ways to do that, but the most common way is by actually bubbling chlorine gas through it. It will dissolve into the water. But also you can add hypochlorite so that you will get those chlorine ions in there, and so they'll end up forming chlorine and killing any bacteria that might be in there, because chlorine is highly toxic. Fortunately, being a large animal, we can get that out. It's not a huge problem for us, but for bacteria it is. And other types of microorganisms. Now that's probably the most common type of cleaning system. There's also chlorine dioxide. It's a little bit more expensive to run. You can't make chlorine dioxide ahead of time. You have to make it on site, so that adds to the cost. But it is effective because of that chlorine. Another one that gets used, and you can look into more detail on these if you'd like, is ozone. And ozone is also poisonous. We think of ozone as being a good thing, which it is when it's up in the upper layers of our atmosphere, because it blocks out a large portion of the UV radiation. But when it's down here, it's actually poisonous, and we don't want to breathe that in. But we can also use that. We can put ozone into the water, and just like with chlorine, it kills those bacteria or parasites or whatever else is in the water. So that's also a very expensive process, because the ozone has to be made on site. So it has to be used on a much larger basis, not very cost effective. The other one that gets used a lot of times in specific homes, but could be used on a larger basis, it is used in Europe quite a bit, is UV. We know that ultraviolet light kills organisms, and so you can use the UV light to kill bacteria or protists or other types of disease vectors that are in the water. And you can use that, but you have to trickle that water through it. It's a little bit more of a time-consuming process, but you're not adding anything to the water. That's some of the benefit to it, is that you're not actually adding chemicals to that water in order to do that. So we know how to clean the water, but one of the bigger issues is how do you prevent that water from getting dirty in the first place? And that's where our sewage treatment plant kind of comes into play. Where's our water coming from? We said that groundwater is kind of filtered out some, but many places get their water from surface water. Being an agricultural state, you're going to end up with things like feces in your water. Runoff from hog confinements, cattle, even chickens. That's going to run into our water at times, and a lot of farmers will spread manure on their fields as a fertilizer, and so as it rains, that runoff ends up in our water, and so we need to clean that out. And so there's different ways to do that. There's also the whole issue of our personal waste. We have bathrooms, and that waste has to go somewhere, so what do we do with it? And so that's what I'm going to kind of ask you to take a look at, is a couple different ways. So we can add chemicals to that water. But I'm going to have you take a look at a site here. This is Arcata Marsh. This is in California, and they kind of go about in a unique way of trying to treat their water in a more natural way. So this ties into what we've been discussing regarding ecosystems and the importance of those ecosystems. And so hopefully you've learned some ideas or have come across some ideas about why ecosystems are important, why that biodiversity is important. And so I had you write a paper on why you think we should or shouldn't evaluate the cost of those ecosystems, whether or not they are providing any benefits. And so here's one where somebody actually reversed the process, and they took a look and said, okay, so they're treating their water by basically making a a marsh using those natural ecosystems. So I'm going to have you kind of take a look at that. But here's the bigger idea. I'd like you to take a look at the Arcata Marsh, and you're going to have to do a little bit of research. But the major goal that I have for you right now is that I would like you to design a water filtration system. About 10 to 15% of the world does not have access to clean, drinkable water. They're being exposed to things like feces in their water or just regular dirt and bacteria. Things like cholera are really, really dangerous. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is try to make a water filtration system based on what materials are available in that place. Now, this is a real problem. It's a real world problem. Especially children and elderly persons are very likely to get sick and could possibly die from having unclean drinking water. And so what I'm asking you to do is really help solve a problem for people in these countries. So I'm going to ask you to take a look at what types of materials would be available in these locations. And I picked a location for you. This one is in Kenya, and you can read about this family and this woman who is writing about her family. But this is in Kenya, and you can maybe do some research about what materials might be available here. Please feel free to ask me some questions. Obviously, because of our limited amount of time that we have, you're going to want to maybe come up with some questions and ask me at the beginning of the period, because I'll have to go back to my regular class. But shoot me an email if you'd like. Ask me in person, that's fine. But I'm asking you to do three things. Design a filtration process which reduces the turbidity of a water sample. So you're trying to remove those pieces that are in the water. Okay, so there's a lot of times there's clay or mud or something that is in the water. It's a very, very common problem. Want you to remove ammonia from the water. So in a lot of places, water is these water locations. That's where not only you're getting your drinking water, but your waste is going there as well. So that could include urine, which is going to break down into ammonia. And that's also true of other decomposing pieces. But ammonia is a pretty serious problem that they have in these water samples. And then the last part is to try to make that fit for a particular, cultural setting. So you might be able to go up to Walmart and buy a bunch of materials to make a water filter, or you can just buy a water filter. But you're not going to be able to do that in a rural section of Kenya. You may not be able to do that in a rural part of Vietnam. So some of these places you're going to have access to certain things. So I've told you Kenya. If you want to look for a different place, you're welcome to do that. Just run it by me, and then we can kind of talk about some of those water-related issues in those locations and what might be available for you to make your water filter out of. So this is essentially a competition. I want you guys to sort of compete in pairs as to try to make the best water filter possible. This is on Schoology, so you don't have to just look at it here, but I have this on Schoology. But that's the major purpose, is I'm trying to get you to solve a real world problem on trying to access clean water. This is an environmental science issue because you need to have access to clean water. So please let me know. All of this will be posted. I'll have the rubric on Schoology as well, so please let me know if you have any questions, and I will I'll be available for any questions that you have online. Thank you.